in their front garden, and they mix it in with their herbaceous planting. So you can actually mix the two very successfully. So that's an option. And as you can see, some beautiful kale growing in with some Russian sage and some tomato plants, and obviously on a smaller scale than someone who has a large back garden, but at least you're growing some of your own food. The other option for many people, of course, especially those who live in the city, is to go with either raised beds or container gardens, because they really don't have the space or enough sunshine, or they're just in an apartment and all they have is a balcony. So the options there are go to containers, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So that's kind of, you want to think a little bit about those things. You need to make sure that for a lot of vegetables, you have a minimum of 6 to 8 hours of sunlight a day. There are some things that can be grown in light shade, but you basically want to make sure that you have a good sunny location, okay? So what's the most important thing to start with? And that is going to be your soil. And I think it's important if you're gardening in the ground, or if you're doing a raised garden in your back garden, get to know your soil. I'm going to skip through this fairly quickly because I think a lot of people are probably more into raised bed and container gardening. So soil is made up of 3 components: clay, sand, and silt. You can actually test your soil with a little soil test kit that you can get at major garden centers or box stores. And it's good to know a little bit about the texture of your soil. Again, this is how it breaks down. Sand is very large particles. Clay is more tightly packed, tends to be sticky. And then sandy loam, which is the perfect soil that everyone would love to have in their gardens, but we're not always blessed with it. So just a few quick pictures to show you how you can get to know if you want to really get to know your garden soil and what it's made out of. You can make it wet, take the large particles out of it, make it wet enough that you can make a ball out of it. If it forms a ball, it's got a certain amount of clay in it. If it doesn't, if it falls apart, it tends to be sandy. And if you can squeeze it between your thumb and your forefinger and make a ribbon, then that determines how much clay is in it as well. And here's a quick chart that I took out of the US Department of Agriculture, I believe, or one of the Extension Services website. And it basically is a flow chart that says, does your soil form a ribbon? If the answer is no, then right off the bat, you're more sand. And then depending on the length of that ribbon, how much of it is sand and how much of it is clay or loam. So very quick test. I mean, it's get your hands in the soil and feel it and play with it and get a sense for what kind of soil you have if you're actually gardening in the ground. I will make a comment that for a lot of people who are in especially new subdivision areas, quite often the builders will have stripped most of the topsoil off and left a fairly compacted subsoil layer with a thin layer of topsoil on top of that. And that is very difficult to garden into. So I would always recommend for people who are in new builds, build yourself some raised beds, either with lumber that you can create boxes, or just, pile soil up on top of an area, remove the sod, flip it upside down, pile soil on top and create a raised bed, because that way you will actually have good soil for the roots of your vegetables, as opposed to struggling to try and get them to grow in that terribly compacted soil that the builders have left behind. Again, I'm going to skip through this one fairly quickly. These are the essential plant elements. They need carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which they get from the air, but the mineral nutrients are the ones that are actually in the soil. The 3 what we call macronutrients, or the primary nutrients, are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And those are the ones that you actually see in the numbers on a bag or a bottle of fertilizer, right? And it's always listed in that order: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. N, P, and K are the actual element symbols for them. And when you buy a fertilizer that's 10, 10, 10, what that is telling you is that it's 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, and 10% potassium. There's also a lot of other stuff in there, and sometimes it will have some of the secondary nutrients as well. Plants need all of these, and if you have a good soil, whether you buy it or whether you create it, they will be able to get these nutrients from the soil. If you do have a garden and you really want to know what's going on with your soil, you can get it tested. The OMAFRA, which is our kind of short form for the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Farming and Rural Affairs, I think, or Food and Rural Affairs. I can't remember what the F is, but they have a website and they have a bunch of accredited labs. You can just take, and they've got detailed instructions how you bag up your soil, send it off. I think for about $50, you can get a full breakdown from a lab that will tell you everything from your soil pH to the macro and micronutrients in it, you know, if you think that's something you want to do. So that was a quick zoom through soil. Any questions at this point, Samantha? I'm looking over here to the side. Nothing?
Looking in the
chat box.
And I don't.
Okay.
But I've just reminded everyone to feel free to use the chat box. If you, in the to area, if you select everyone, or you can select my name, Samantha, that way everyone can see your question or it can be directed to me, and then we'll get to your.
Yeah, I do want to encourage, if you do have questions, to, you know, feel free to put them in the chat box. And if I don't get to them, you know, right on that particular point, we will try and address it before the end of the session. Thank you. Okay, so you've done a little bit of work on your soil, and it's time to start thinking about the next aspect of your vegetable. What is your vegetable garden style? And of course, again, this isn't relevant for people, not as relevant for people. There are other topics on raised bed and container gardening. But if you've got a, you know, a big garden and you want to think about, you know, you want your garden, your vegetable garden to be aesthetically pleasing as well. So traditional vegetable gardens, you know, typically were big, they were dedicated, they had beds for one vegetable, lots of rows, space in between, and that would be the way that, you know, people grew their vegetables back before we even had supermarkets. People don't have that kind of space available to them anymore, or time to dedicate to that kind of vegetable gardening, because that requires, I'm just looking at the amount of bare soil there and thinking, oh my God, the weeding must be a nightmare. So there are alternatives. The French potager, or kitchen garden, as it's called in Britain, is a very different style. It tends to have usually raised beds, and they're mixed. They don't plant all of the onions in one patch. They might, you know, space kale in with squashes and throw in some herbs and some flowers, and, you know, everything's kind of mixed together, and it's more of a cottage-like planting or a cottage-like feeling. Some of the benefits, of course, is that, you know, if you're going to get something, whether it's potato beetle or whatever, they're going to have a little more trouble finding your potatoes if they're scattered in different parts of your garden than if they're in one bed and all in a nice handy row. So there are some benefits to doing that as well. And it's just aesthetically a different style. If you're a very formal person, you're going to love the more traditional. If you're more of a, you know, informal garden style, then, you know, the French potager might be it. Here we get to, you know, for most people who have very limited space available, there are options for them. You can go and get these beautiful, you can buy them, you can have somebody who's handy build you one of these big, you know, veg trugs up on legs when you don't even have to bend over, which is great for those of us who are reaching the point where bending over is becoming more difficult. Or you can convert almost anything to a container. As you can see, we've got cucumbers in grow bags. They could even be grocery bags, as long as the containers have drainage. So one of the things I've seen people even take those standard, I don't know how many liter pails that you can get from the big box stores and grow tomatoes in them. Absolutely, just make sure you drill holes in the bottom, because there are no vegetables that want to be sitting in soggy soil. They want the water to be able to move through, and that's an important point. And as you can see, someone's taken a box and rigged a beautiful kind of frame around it to support their tomato plants. And same with the cucumbers. There's a nice, you can see the kind of support system that they put in for those cucumber vines. And those bags are sitting on asphalt. So, if you don't have ground to put them on, it's fine to just put them on your patio or balcony or wherever you have space. I see a question here. I'm just looking at it. What about herb gardens that can transition from balcony back indoors in the fall? Ooh. So transitioning plants indoors in fall is a very tricky endeavor. And there's two major reasons why it's tricky. First of all, quite often people will just dig a plant up. Rosemary is one of the, and I've killed more rosemary plants than I want to admit. Rosemary is one of them, and you just put it in a pot and you bring it inside. What happens is that the plant is moving from, whether we like to acknowledge it or not, from a beautiful full sun, God knows how much daylight it's getting, to an indoor location where it's getting a fraction of that. I don't care how many windows you have, you're going to you're going to shock that plant, because it's suddenly going to have a severe reduction in light available to it. So what you need to do if you want your herbs to come inside, the other reason why you're going to have problems is quite often plants that move from outdoors to indoors, number one, we stress them, number two, they bring bugs with them. And so you're going to be introducing aphids, whitefly, mealybugs, any number of things that could be accidentally hitchhiking with your outdoor plants coming indoors. So my recommendation, and I've done it. I think out of the 3 I brought in last fall, I have 1 surviving rosemary plant. How pathetic is that? You can bring herbs inside, especially those that are perennial herbs like lavender, like rosemary, oregano. Other herbs, parsley, and maybe thyme as well, parsley, basil, other things like that, I would just seed them in pots indoors. So those seedlings are going to start growing already in an indoor environment. You're going to be able to control the fact that they won't have bugs on them, because you'll be growing them in a clean soil. And I would just say for windowsill growing, it's probably a lot easier just to start your own from seed rather than to try and dig up stuff from the garden. Hopefully that answers your questions.
We had a question from Chris a little earlier. I don't know if you're going to get to this a little later, but suggestions if you have to buy soil in the store.
Oh, okay. If you need to buy soil, any of the big box stores, even the grocery stores sell bags of soil, fine. I know that my superstore sells, and I even have a couple here. They call it black soil. It's $2 a bag, right? If you need to buy that soil, it's great. Just make sure that if you're doing a raised container bed that's actually on the ground, that kind of soil is fine. If you are doing actual containers like pots, then specifically look for container soil, because they will be lighter. You don't want actual garden soil, because what happens is with all the watering you're going to do, you're going to be compacting it, and you're going to compact it around the roots and make it difficult for the plant to grow. So I recommend buying a container mix, which usually is what we call a soilless mix. It will have peat, it will have compost, it will have perlite, possibly vermiculite in it, but it will be very lightweight. And you want that for container gardens. The ones that will say for vegetables, fruit and vegetables on them We'll probably also have a little bit of fertilizer mixed in with them that will help the plants get going when you first plant them in that container. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about fertilizing. So yes, you can absolutely buy bags of soil at the grocery, big box stores, whatever. I mean, you know, it's all good soil.
Great.
Okay.
There's a question from Karen, but we might be getting into this a little later, so I can bring it up when you get further into your presentation.
All right. So we've talked about soil, we've talked about your style, preparing a garden. You know, obviously if you've got the big vegetable garden out back, you want to remove the turf, you want to take out any stones or rocks, and you want to just lightly turn it over with a fork or a spade. I know that people used to rototill their gardens. That's no longer recommended. A lot of new soil science indicates that by rototilling, we're actually destroying what is called the food web. And that web consists of millions of microorganisms that actually live in our soil, anywhere from earthworms to tiny little specks of microbes. So by rototilling, you're actually you're destroying all of that important food web in the soil. So a light forking over of just the top layer to break it up because it's been compacted under lawn is all you need to do. If you're creating a raised bed on a lawn space, what you can also do is, as you can see here, that area has been, sometimes people put cardboard down, sometimes they just put a layer of some kind of mulch or compost. Then you can add landscape fabric on top, hold it down with rocks, and it'll take a while, I would say up to a year, to completely kill off all of that sod by doing that. I mean, it's a no-dig method, which is great. So if you've got the patience for it, you can do it that way. And of course, you can see the photo there of the mix. That's a typical mixture that you will see for container growing. And those little white specks are called perlite. Perlite is actually like it's a popped volcanic rock, and it holds a lot of moisture. And so you want some of those moisture holding particles in your container soil, because you don't want it to just drain right out. You want it to hold some of that moisture around the roots. Okay, so we're getting ready. And we have another poll.
Oh, we have another poll.
So let's talk about the poll, and then we'll go and do some questions at the same time. So we just want to know, now that you've kind of got some ideas, what type of vegetable garden will you be planting? For those who are already vegetable gardening, you can tell us what you're already doing. And for those who are just new to it and getting into it, you can tell us what you think you're going to be doing. And then I'll go and look at a couple. Here's the question from Karen about which vegetable plants will grow indoors. So that depends. So in summer, if you have a south or west facing window and you get a lot of sunlight, you might be able to grow a small cherry tomato plant, or I buy at the grocery store those lettuce plants that come with the roots on them. And I will often take those when I've taken most of the outside leaves off. I'll pop those into a pot and put that onto a west-facing windowsill, and I'll actually get regrown lettuce. I've seen people, I haven't done this myself, regrow celery from the base, so it will actually root and you can regrow celery. I've actually taken an onion out of my onion bag, you know, they started to sprout, and I've repotted those, and then I just use those kind of like green onions. The problem with our homes is, you know, our windows, for energy efficiency, they filter out some of the UV rays. And so those plants that need all of that sunlight are not necessarily getting enough UV. So your best options are those things that will survive in a little bit of shade. So some of the greens, lettuces, some greens, like, you know, mesclun or mache, or even, you know, sprouts. I mean, like, you know, microgreens, sorry, I meant microgreens. You know, you could grow those indoors, but anything that is a big fruiting plant that, number one, needs pollinators and needs 6 to 8 hours of sunlight is going to be a challenge to grow indoors unless you have supplemental light and very special growing conditions. So that was Karen's question. No digging only applied to ground or pots too. So potting soil, you obviously, if you're buying it, you're mixing it up anyway. So, digging doesn't necessarily apply to potting soil. You want to make sure that it's good and friable and mixed up when you put it in your pots. Can you place newspaper on the grass? Instead of, and I'm just trying to see the rest of the question here. It's kind of off the end of my screen. And then pour soil on top to start a garden. That's basically a bit of a modification of where I say, people will use cardboard. They will also use layers of wet newspaper and put that on top and then put the soil on top of that. The problem is you need to wait for that turf underneath there to actually, unless you're putting like a full foot of soil on it, you're going to have to wait for that to die back a bit. And that, you could wait a few weeks because without sunlight, eventually it'll start, but a full year and it will, the roots and all of that, because turf tends to weave into a thick mat. So unless you're putting a good layer on top, you might have a little bit of a challenge digging through the actual lawn. So, but you could try it. My poll won't submit, but I'm, okay. So here,
we'll add one to the container.
We'll add one to the container. Yeah. So great. 61% of you are growing in containers. So, we won't spend a lot of time talking about, but there are some that are doing mixed gardening as well. So, good to see what everyone's doing. Thank you. So let's see if we can move on here. Whoop. Where did I end up? Oh, here we go. So we've talked about soil, we've talked about your vegetable style, what, where and how you're going to be growing. Now let's talk about what you're going to be growing. So, the first thing I always say to people when it comes to new vegetable gardeners about what you're going to grow in your vegetable garden, grow what you eat. I mean, just think about when you go to the grocery store, what are the things that you're typically buying? If you're lettuce, tomato, cucumber, start with those three. If you like, green beans, add green beans to the mix. So or poll members of your family that you're feeding as well. What are their favorite vegetables and maybe add those. So that's one way you can go. And let me tell you, there's loads of lists that you can go and get on the internet that will tell you, what the top 10 most popular vegetables are. I always take those with a grain of salt because I would say that depends on who you're asking, because, somebody who comes from continental Europe is going to be growing something very different in the southern US or someone who comes from Asia. So again, depending on your ethnic background, there are vegetables that, may not be readily available in grocery stores that, you would love to be able to grow yourself. By all means, try and find the seeds for those vegetables. And there's a lot of different seed companies in Canada or even in the US that send seed into Canada that you can get some really interesting exotic vegetables like those cucamelons that I mentioned, or, I'm growing. So this year, I think I'm growing a cucumber, which is called crystal apple. And I think it's about this big around and it's completely kind of a creamy white color. I have no idea what it's going to taste like, but I'm about to find out. So there's all kinds of cool and interesting things that you can find. If you don't have a seed catalog, I mean, any of the major stores, including the dollar stores, sell packages of seeds. So you can just go and pick up some packages. If you're a new gardener, pick up a couple of packages of seeds. Try 3 or 4 for your first year in your containers just to see, make notes about when you sow them, how well they grow, and then build your knowledge and build on your success, and away you go.
That's good advice.
So you need to understand a little bit about vegetables as well to be successful with gardening. So there are a couple of, I just need to click this off of here. Hang on, sorry. A number of ways that vegetables are actually divided up. So we talk about cool and warm season vegetables, and then the plants themselves are either annuals, biennials, or perennials. And it helps to understand that because that will, that'll have some challenge. Growing any perennial vegetable will certainly have challenges for somebody who's doing it in containers because of our winters. So cool or warm season, there are a lot of plants that love to grow in spring and fall and are not happy during the heat of summer. And those tend to be things like leafy greens, a lot of our root vegetables, peas, all sorts of, and even a few herbs, although most of our herbs come from the Mediterranean area and they really don't like cool weather at all. But things like I've also already noticed, you know, my oregano plant, my thyme, I mean, their chives are going absolutely crazy in my garden already. So there are some herbs that do start quickly. And knowing that there are things that you can grow in cool seasons means you can start gardening really early, especially if you're growing in containers, because the soil in the ground takes a lot longer. That's a huge mass. It takes a lot longer to heat it, to warm up. If you just have a pot and you're putting regular container soil or potting soil into it, it will warm up a lot faster, especially if it's in a sunny location. And you could be starting, you know, potatoes, carrots, radishes, lettuces in a container. As long as you have it in a sheltered spot, it shouldn't be have any problems even with frost, because these plants are all pretty tough. They will take a little bit of frost. You could always cover them up with a little bit of plastic or a cloth of some type if we had a really, really cool night, but you wouldn't need to worry about them being killed off. Anybody who plants tomatoes at this time of year, you know, will have a lot of problems. And I'll talk about that in a second as well. So, you know, to carry on with cool season plants, look at the whole variety of things that you could already have growing in your garden right now if you had already started planting these. So lettuces, spinach, Swiss chard, kale, all of the different kinds of greens for salads. And you could do these as what we call cut and come again. So you cut them, you harvest them, and they regrow, and a week later you've got more that you can come and harvest. And you could be harvesting a lot of fresh greens as early as, you know, late April, depending on your location and how much sun and shelter you have available.
We have a question from Miriam. She said, or she asked, can I reuse soil in a container from last summer to grow plants, flowers, or veggies this summer?
You can. I've done it. I find that what happens is over the winter, they, you know, depending on what kind of mix it's in, they tend to sort of turn into like a big hard bale of soil. So what I would do, if you have another container that you can tip that one into, I would do that. I would break it all up and I would mix it with some compost or some fresh potting mix or something, just because that soil will have been exhausted. It won't have a lot of nutritional value left in it. So maybe add, I would focus on adding some good organic matter to it to kind of give your plants a little bit of a head start, okay? All right. So we're still on cool vegetables. So here's all the stuff that could be growing in the ground. I haven't planted my potatoes yet, but I've got them sitting here chitting in my my sunroom office, and I'm getting ready to do that this weekend. But you know, potatoes are great for growing in containers, by the way. I have got some specific potato growing bags that I bought from Home Hardware. They're actually Mark's Choice. They've got a little flap on the bottom. So if you actually want to harvest potatoes, you can just open the flap and get in there and sort of fish around in the soil and take out some new potatoes. So they're kind of cool. But there's, as I mentioned before, grocery bags, put some soil in the bottom, put in some seed potatoes and wait until they start to grow, add another layer of potatoes. And then, about when it gets 2/3 full, then, you want to let those plants mature before you harvest them. So, as you can see, the potatoes growing in bags. So lots of things that you could already be growing in your garden now, because a lot of people think, oh, I have to wait until it's usually the long weekend in May before they start planting things, but you can actually start earlier than that.
That's a good segue to this question. Just because we have an unseasonally cooler spring that's reached -3, will that affect cold weather crops?
No,
So
no.
you're good.
You're good. So, if they're very tiny seedlings and they've just started, I would take the precaution of covering them on a cold night. But it's amazing how many of these plants are actually, tough enough to take if it were going down to -8 or 9, then I would take more protective measures, even just newspaper over the top with plastic over top of that, just to keep the air around those plants a degree or 2 warmer. They'll be fine. So I see another question here. How do I protect my plants from diseases and bugs without pesticides? I don't really get into the pesticide talk here, because that's really a whole separate topic. But my recommendations are basically, if your soil is healthy and your plant is healthy, if you water it regularly, you fertilize it. If it's in a container, it will need some fertilizing, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Keep the plant healthy. You should be able to keep it fairly pest and disease free. Okay?
We have a few more questions coming in.
Wow, coming in. I'm growing potatoes from
Yes.
food scraps. Am I doing wrong and the weather is not helping also? Okay, so potatoes. I know that there are people who like to use leftover potatoes that they have in a bag because they start getting eyes on them and they think, oh, I can use these to grow. Sometimes potatoes have been treated with something to stop them from sprouting. So if they're not sprouting, then likely potatoes that have been treated. I always recommend, and they're not expensive, you can go to the stores and buy seed potatoes. The seed potatoes have been treated, but usually with a fungicide to prevent soil disease getting onto the potato, but they are specifically meant to be seed potatoes. So I would recommend, if you can, we've all done it. We've all taken, potatoes that have sprouted and done that. But if they're not sprouting and they're not growing, it makes me wonder if they've been treated to actually prevent them from sprouting, and sometimes they are. The weather isn't helping, but for those things that are going in the ground and the soil is cool, they don't care. They'll grow. Carrot seeds germinate in 10 degrees Celsius and take 7. How can it germinate in the last few days? Okay. So,
mine have been. I see carrots, and maybe it's the warmer days we've had, but I've had some coming up.
Well, again, what I'm saying is that if you're growing in containers as opposed to in the garden, your soil is likely warming up much more quickly. That's one of the reasons why a number of years ago I started to, even though I have a huge property, I started to switch my it's one of the reasons I switched my garden to raised beds. So I had my husband buy some lumber, build me some raised beds, because they drain more quickly. The soil dries up and it also warms up more quickly. So, again, you want to test the soil, grab a handful. If it's too wet and it sticks together, then it's not ready to be worked or planted in. So, you kind of get a bit of a sense of when your soil is ready to be planted. Okay. So, sorry, I was just on where was I? Peas, another great cool weather crop. Peas, of course, are a vine, so they need something to grow up. You can see lots of great ideas for how you can have peas growing up vines. I can remember when I was a kid, I grew up in Whitby, and we used to have the Stokely Van Camp factory just down the road. And in the spring, the trucks would drive by on their way to the factory to can the peas. And sometimes the vines would fall off the back, and we would run after them and pick them and just eat the peas right off the vines. So I still do that. If I grow peas in the garden and I walk by, I'm snapping pea pods off and eating them as snack food. So that's the cold weather plants. The warm season plants, so those are all of the ones that come from, you know, South America or the Mediterranean area, and they love two things. They love warm feet and they love really hot noses, shall we say. So they like to be in hot, full sun. They don't like to dry out, but they do like warmer temperatures. Your lettuces and some of your other, even your peas, when we hit July and the temperature starts regularly hitting 30 degrees Celsius, you'll see all of those plants they'll fade away. The lettuces will bolt, they will flower, they will set seed because it's an annual and it's triggered by, you know, how much sun they're getting. But the tomatoes and the peppers and the eggplants love that heat, and that's when they flourish. So you want to be waiting to plant those vegetables until the soil is really, really warm. I'm trying to think of about 20, I would say at least 20 degrees Celsius. And usually you can tell 18 to 20. Put your finger in the soil, and if it doesn't, you know, if it's not feeling cold, then it's usually warm enough. My rule of thumb for planting these is June 1st. I know everybody says, oh, you know, after the last frost-free date. No, wait a bit, and it's worth it to wait a bit for the soil to warm up. Why? Because if you take a plant and you're buying a tomato plant that's been grown in a really nice warm greenhouse at your garden center, hopefully it's been hardened off for the outdoors, and you're going to take that poor thing and you're going to put it straight into cold, wet soil, it is going to sulk for a long time. And so you're going to have a tomato plant that isn't going to set out new roots and really start actively growing until after it reaches the temperature that it wants to. And you will have set it back a certain amount of time. It's worth it. If you can, pot them up into a pot that you can move around your garden as opposed to putting them into your garden soil. If you're going straight into containers, yes, you can do that. Just make sure that the air temperature is not, that we don't get any really late frost. And this has been a weird May, you know, and I know we've had frost as late as almost the last week in May. So you want to make sure that any of these plants are not exposed to any kind of frost because they will not make it through. Okay. Are there plants that are good to co-plant with tomatoes and cucumbers? Sure. I mean, you can, if you're mixing things up, you can put in nasturtiums, you can put in marigolds, annuals mostly, because of course you don't want to be planting perennials in with your annual vegetables, but you know, any kind of the annual cosmos, whatever you like, you can, you know, mix it up to your heart's content. It isn't, there aren't any specific hard and fast rules about, you know, things will make good companion plants. There's some anecdotal information. The Farmer's Almanac is full of great stories about, you know, what works well together. So any kind of flowers that you want to grow with them, just remember, depending on the size of your container, a mature tomato plant is pretty big. And cucumber vine is going to need a lot of space to grow up. So, you know, something like a nasturtium, which tends to kind of fall over the edge of a container, might be a better option, or that kind of low growing flower, as opposed to something that's going to try and get tall. Okay. Where was I? So tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers. You can see someone here's got a really sophisticated growing system for their pepper plants. They've even got little, you know, irrigation system, little tips going in, making sure that those, you know, plants are getting lots of, you know, watering regularly, because that's also important for tomatoes and peppers. And you can see that they're planted right up against a house. And one of the things I will say, if you're growing peppers in pots is to try and give them a sheltered place. They really don't like a lot of wind. So, and as I said, they like a lot of heat. So if you can get them against a wall, a brick wall that radiates the heat at night, perfect location to put your pepper eggplants as well. Okay. I want to move through this because I want to make sure we make it all the way through. Lots of different examples of pots that you can use. I'll just make a quick note. Clay pots are porous and they dry out more quickly. So if you're planting in clay pots, be ready to water at least twice a day, because I've got clay pots and I water in the morning and they're cork dry again by 5 o'clock in the afternoon and you're watering again. So just beware if you're using clay.
Would that be the same with like the felt or fabric bags?
Not as much, because even though there is some movement of air through them, they can, you know, not dry out quite as quickly. Clay tends to almost like pull the moisture out. But, you know, what I've always said to people is the bigger, the better. So, you know, the bigger the container you can manage, the better it is, because that's the less, you know, surface area per amount of soil in it to dry out. So you really want to make sure it can maintain. So if you're gone for the whole day and you're working, you don't want to come home and have your tomato plant completely wilted because it didn't get, you know, water at noon or something. Mm-hmm. Here's some options for container growings for cucumbers, pumpkins, squash, any of the heavy fruited gourds. If you're going to grow them up any kind of a trellising system, be prepared to provide the fruit itself with some support at some point in time, especially for any of the squashes and the pumpkins. You know, there's I've seen all kinds of stuff on the internet about little slings that you can create to support the heavier squashes and fruits. Okay, so I want to get into talking about how you can maximize your garden a bit. So we're going to talk about intensive square foot gardening. We've already spent a lot of time on raised beds and containers. Some succession planting and a bit on crop rotation. So companion planting is on here, and I just want to, and I've mentioned it before, there are some notions that some plants, you know, do better when they're planted together. There isn't a lot of science behind it. There's a lot of anecdote, but, you know, I have planted marigolds with potatoes in an effort to try and keep potato beetles away from my potato plants. So if you want to do some, you know, read up on companion planting and try some, feel free to do that. I know people who will say nasturtiums will help to draw aphids away from their, you know, aphid prone plants. It depends. So experiment, try it. We do have a presentation that one of our gardeners has put together on companion planting, so maybe that will be something we can do in the future. Mm-hmm. Okay, so intensive gardening. And for most of you who are container gardening, this is what you're going to be doing. You're going to try and maximize every square foot of space you have available. So you want to plant in groups. You can make it formal, like square foot, or you can make it informal. You want to make sure that you're using plants that can be crammed together. So if you're selecting tomato plants or seeds, look for those that are listed as bush or patio varieties. They tend to be smaller plants. They can be put into smaller spaces. Same with, you know, some of the kale plants, or, you know, baby butter crunch lettuce as opposed to butter crunch, which is bigger. So if it says baby or something else on it, it generally tends to be a smaller plant. And that means you can cram it in a little bit closer. You want to make sure that your soil is really good. And at this point, if you're in containers, after your plants have started to grow, I would say on a bi-weekly basis, you want to be fertilizing, because that soil, that container soil that you used, as I said, might have some fertilizer mixed in it, but the plants will exhaust it fairly quickly. So what you want to do is have a regular, and, you know, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be a liquid 10-10-10 fertilizer. You know, you can mix up your own. Some people believe in making compost tea, whatever, you know, fish fertilizer, whatever your preference is. just make sure you're giving your plants, and I would say err on the weak side of whatever it recommends on the box or the bottle. When you mix it with water, you don't want to cause any fertilizer burn. So there are some great examples. Square foot gardening, it's exactly what it sounds like. You know, you have a box, you mark it in feet, and there's all of these great planting guidelines that are available on the internet. Again, take some of those with a grain of salt, but if you buy smaller versions of plants, you can, you know, kind of squeeze them into a square foot. A tomato plant will not fit in a square foot unless it's a tiny Tim one. You might be able to get one of those very small cherry tomato plants in a square foot. Most of my tomato plants are in they sprawl into like 4 square feet. So, you know, you have to know a little bit about that. Raised bed gardening, for those of us like me who are getting a little bit older, and our, you know, our backs don't necessarily like being bent over all day, raised beds are the perfect way to go. You can build an edge on it that you can sit on. And as I mentioned earlier, they warm up and dry out more quickly in the spring. It's a perfect way to do vegetable gardening with less work. It's also accessible, so I've seen special built ones for those who use wheelchairs or walkers that you can actually just sort of drive a wheelchair into and have 3 beds that are easily at the same height and can be very easily reached. It also reduces weeding. If you're buying soil and putting it in, then you're not dealing with all of the weed seeds that are already in your soil. So it extends your growing season. So remember I said it warms up earlier in the spring? Well, it also stays warm longer during the fall season. Sorry, touched my mouse the wrong way. Succession planting. So what you can do, and you can do this in containers as well as you can do it in you know, raised beds. I talked about, you know, the cool season plants and the warm season plants. So you can start growing lettuce and other cool season plants, you know, spring onions, whatever, in April and May. By the time you get to July, they're not happy anymore. So you take them out and you put in all of your really warm season plants, you know, your peppers, your eggplant, that will, you know, go right through until late August, even into the middle of September. Then you can take those out, harvest them, and plant kale, lettuce, you know, any of the members of the cabbage family. And with good protection, you can actually be harvesting, or even carrots. You could be harvesting almost up till Christmas, you know, if you can protect those plants from the heavier frosts. So you can extend your harvest, you can maximize your garden space. You can do succession planting. So I don't plant all of my beans or my carrots at once, or radishes. You know, you can be sowing those every 7 to 10 or 14 days so that you can have a continuous harvest from those. And whoosh, I think this is the last one, plant families. So I want to talk about this really quickly for those of you. It's more for people who grow in the ground than containers, but it helps to know a little bit about plant families. There are 9. The last one is miscellaneous. A lot of plants belong to the same family, so it's good to know that spinach and beetroot or beets and Swiss chard are part of the same family. The cabbage family is everywhere, everything from sprouts up through broccoli and cauliflower. Which ones are a member of the carrot family? And the reason why it's good to know this is because if you are growing in raised beds or in the ground, you want to practice crop rotation. And this is a good way to move those plants like legumes, beans that are nitrogen fixers. They provide nitrogen in the soil for the heavy feeders, which are your root vegetables. And then you can move to your cucumbers and your lighter feeding, which are your greens. And if you do that, number one, you're maximizing your soil, you know, that whole soil food web I talked about, and the amount of nitrogen that's available for plants. And number two, you're preventing certain soil-borne diseases. So you know, tomatoes and potatoes are prone to late blight. So you don't want to grow them in the same bed 2 years in a row. Cabbages are prone to, I think, something called club root. So you don't want to be growing those in the same space 2 years in a row. So by rotating through your garden, you're actually making sure that your vegetables that you're growing are healthy and that you're preventing certain soil-borne diseases from getting into your garden. Okay.
We have a question from
We have a
Priscilla.
question.
Yeah. Do you choose chicken wire to keep raccoons and bunnies out, or what is the most humane way so that they don't get at everything you're growing?
So the only way to prevent bunny rabbits from getting into your garden is fencing. That's it. I mean, I know people have tried the sprays and whatever. I have rabbits all over my property. And let me tell you, the only way to prevent them from getting to a plant is by creating some kind of a barrier. I leave a certain amount of stuff that, you know, I know is going to fall prey to the rabbits and hope they don't get to the rest. Raccoons are a lot trickier because they can climb over a chicken wire fence absolutely no problem. So the only way to prevent a raccoon from getting at your vegetable garden is to like completely enclose it, top, sides, bottom, everything, so that they can't climb in. But I mean, they've got those, you know, if they want to get at something, I know people who've had raccoons rip apart their chicken coops, and, you know, they can rip through a lot of stuff. So raccoons are a bit more of a challenge, but one of the recommendations that I made to a client a number of years ago who was having problems with raccoons is to, if you can afford it, to invest in, and I think it's one of these motion activated sprinklers. So it's actually like a sprinkler arm, and if an animal crosses in front of it, it actually is activated and it squirts out a jet of water, which startles them. And if they get hit with that a couple of times, they'll likely leave that garden or that area. You know, they'll pass around, they won't bother going after it. And that's the only thing some people use, like, you know, loud noises, but raccoons are, you know, they're a huge urban problem. I get it, you know. So good luck. Okay. Yes, they are very smart. Too smart.
They know
all right. So I have one last chart. Do I have enough time to go through this last chart, Samantha?
Yeah, I think we can go through it. And if anyone, my apologies that we're going over, but I think we should finish everything you have here because it's great.
I'm trying to.
But if anyone
move through as quickly as I can. So fall soil recipe, for those of you who are, you know, either raised bed gardens, you don't have to worry about this if you're doing containers, but, you know, here's a great way to reuse all of the chopped stalks, extra leaves, whatever you have from your garden, chop them all up, take the leaves out of your garden, any leftover mulch, whatever compost, spread it onto your bed. Top dress it. If you've got access to manure, great. If not, you know, just put the leaves from your garden over top and leave it for the winter. And all of those microorganisms and the earthworms and, you know, the other critters that live in there, when they come back to life in the spring, they will move all of that organic matter into the soil. And it is the best way that you can feed your soil. So I'm going to move on, and that's it. Great. So last questions, and if there are further questions, and I want to move to this. So here is how you can get in touch with the Durham Master Gardeners. Our website, our email address, we have a Facebook page, and we always have people monitoring our email, our Facebook, as well as our Instagram account. So if you have a comment or a question, feel free to reach out and contact us.
Great. We have one question on here. Let's see. The leaves underneath from last year have not decomposed. Should I take them away this year?
The leaves underneath,
probably from the garden bed, haven't decomposed over the winter.
They typically will decompose as soon as the weather warms up. So you can dig them through your garden if you want to, but just leave them. They're fine. You can plant right through them.
Great, great. So I think, does anyone have any questions coming in? It doesn't look like it, But thank you so much, Ingrid, for providing this information. And if anyone has any additional questions, you can also email sustainability@centennialcollege.ca. We did record this presentation, so we can also make it available to all those who have joined, just so you have it as a resource going forward. And we hope to bring you more presentations. I will be sending out a short survey at the end, and there'll be actually a question on that in terms of what next you'd be interested in learning more about. So make sure you tune in or complete that survey. And like I said, this is kind of part of growing or cultivating that community within Centennial College. If you keep track of all of the social media accounts on Centennial College, there's going to be a hashtag floating around, CC Green Thumb. So a lot of tips and posts and blogs that will be coming up will have that hashtag, so you can search that for more content. And again, please reach out if you have any gardening tips or would like to share your garden. We can work together to share that content out to the Centennial community and help everyone in their food growing adventures this season. So I think that...
And we would love to see them on our Facebook page. So
oh yeah,
for our
so
pictures, feel free to drop them onto Durham Master Gardeners. We'd love to see.
Perfect, perfect. So I hope everyone stays safe and you enjoyed this information, and hopefully we'll see everyone again. And thank you again, Ingrid, for joining us.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.